They say courage under fire shapes a soldier, but nobody warns you that corporate boardrooms can be deadlier than any battlefield. I should have known something was wrong when Marcus Sterling's handshake lasted 3 seconds too long during our first meeting, his smile too practiced, too empty. Here I was, fresh from closing the largest defense technology contract in aerospace history, a $2.8 billion deal that would revolutionize military communications globally, and my own CEO was looking at me like I'd just walked into my own execution. 22 years I'd given to this country. 4 tours overseas, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Distinguished Service Cross that collected dust in my apartment while I rebuilt myself in the civilian world. After leaving the Army as a lieutenant colonel, I'd channeled that same relentless focus into the private sector, specifically into Apex Defense Solutions, a mid-tier contractor that specialized in secure satellite communications for military operations. When I joined 5 years ago, we were pulling in maybe $200 million annually, competing for scraps against the defense giants like Lockheed and Raytheon. But I saw something others missed. During my final deployment in Afghanistan, I'd witnessed firsthand how communication breakdowns cost lives. Encrypted satellite feeds that lagged during critical operations, ground units losing contact with command during firefights, intelligence that arrived minutes too late to matter. The technology existed to fix these problems, but nobody was connecting the dots between battlefield reality and engineering possibility. So I made it my mission to bridge that gap. My background gave me credibility that most defense contractors could only dream of. When I walked into Pentagon briefings, generals didn't see another sales representative trying to push overpriced gadgets. They saw someone who'd called in airstrikes under enemy fire. Someone who understood that their communications equipment wasn't just hardware. It was the difference between soldiers coming home and families receiving folded flags. That authenticity, combined with a genuine understanding of operational needs, became my greatest asset. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Colonel Sarah Mitchell at the Defense Communications Agency. She was frustrated with the current satellite communication systems that couldn't maintain stable connections in challenging terrain, particularly in mountainous regions where our forces operated in contested areas. Traditional systems required line-of-sight connections that enemy forces could easily disrupt, and the backup protocols were so slow that real-time tactical coordination became impossible. I spent 6 months developing a proposal for an adaptive, mesh network system that could maintain secure communications even when primary satellites were compromised or blocked. The concept wasn't entirely new, but my approach integrated multiple redundant pathways through commercial satellite networks, military-specific frequencies, and ground-based relay stations that could be rapidly deployed by special operations teams. More importantly, I designed the system with input from actual field commanders who understood the operational constraints that engineers typically overlooked. The technical specifications alone filled 300 pages. But the real innovation was in the implementation strategy. Instead of requiring massive infrastructure overhauls, my system could integrate with existing equipment through modular upgrades that could be installed by standard maintenance crews. This meant faster deployment, lower training costs, and compatibility with legacy systems that the military couldn't afford to replace immediately. When I presented the initial concept to our engineering team at Apex, the response was mixed. Our lead engineer, David Chen, appreciated the technical elegance but worried about manufacturing costs. Our operations director, Jennifer Walsh, questioned whether we had the production capacity to handle a contract of that magnitude. But I'd done my homework on the financial projections, the supply chain requirements, and the timeline for implementation. The real challenge was getting in front of the right decision-makers. Defense procurement moves slowly, and breaking into the inner circle of major contract decisions requires relationships that take years to develop. Fortunately, my military network proved invaluable. Former colleagues who'd transitioned to Pentagon roles, fellow veterans working for prime contractors, and defense industry consultants who remembered my reputation from active duty. The pivotal moment came during the annual Defense Technology Summit in Arlington. I'd secured a booth for Apex, but our presence was overshadowed by the major players, who commanded entire pavilions. While companies like Northrop Grumman showcased million-dollar displays with interactive demonstrations, we had a modest setup with printed materials and a laptop running simulation software. But sometimes the best opportunities come from unexpected encounters. General Patricia Rodriguez, the newly appointed head of Defense Communications Modernization, stopped by our booth almost by accident. She'd been walking toward the Raytheon Pavilion when she noticed our display showing real-time communication, latency comparisons between traditional satellite systems and our proposed mesh network. What started as a casual conversation turned into a 40-minute technical discussion that drew a small crowd of Pentagon officials and defense journalists. General Rodriguez asked pointed questions about signal encryption, system redundancy, and battlefield durability, exactly the kinds of operational concerns that most vendors couldn't address with genuine expertise. But I'd lived through communication, failures in combat zones, and I could speak to the real-world implications of technical specifications with a level of detail that impressed even the general's senior staff. By the end of that conversation, I had preliminary interest from 3 different Pentagon departments and invitations to submit formal proposals for 2 separate procurement processes. More importantly, General Rodriguez personally recommended that we be included in the fast-track evaluation for the Unified Communications Initiative, the Defense Department's most ambitious modernization program in 2 decades. The next 8 months were the most intense period of my professional life. The proposal process required detailed technical specifications, cost projections, manufacturing timelines, security clearance documentation, and performance guarantees that would make or break our company's future. I was working 18-hour days, coordinating with our engineering team, legal department, compliance officers, and external consultants who specialized in defense procurement regulations. The complexity of a $2.8 billion defense contract extends far beyond the technical requirements. Every component had to be sourced from approved vendors, manufactured in facilities with appropriate security clearances, and tested according to military standards that were often classified themselves. The documentation alone filled multiple filing cabinets, and the review process involved dozens of Pentagon officials, congressional oversight committees, and independent auditors. But the real pressure came from competition. Once word spread that the Unified Communications Initiative was moving forward, every major defense contractor began positioning for what industry analysts were calling the largest communications technology contract in military history. Lockheed Martin assembled a team of 300 engineers and consultants. Boeing partnered with Microsoft and Amazon to leverage their cloud computing expertise. Raytheon formed a consortium with European defense companies to offer international compatibility. Against these titans, Apex Defense Solutions looked like a startup trying to compete with Fortune 500 companies. We had 47 employees, limited manufacturing capacity, and a track record that, while impressive for our size, couldn't match the resume of companies that had been building military systems for decades. On paper, we had no business competing for a contract of this magnitude, but I had advantages that couldn't be quantified in traditional business metrics. My proposal wasn't just technically superior, it was written by someone who understood the operational realities that would determine whether the system actually worked in combat situations. While our competitors focused on impressive specifications and corporate credentials, I emphasized practical benefits that would matter to soldiers in the field. The turning point came during the final presentation phase, where each competing company had 4 hours to demonstrate their system capabilities to a panel of Pentagon officials, military commanders, and technical experts. The presentations were held in a secure facility outside Washington, with each vendor allocated a conference room equipped with government-standard testing equipment. Lockheed went first, delivering a polished presentation with professional graphics, detailed cost breakdowns, and demonstrations of their system's technical capabilities. Their team included former Pentagon officials, renowned engineers, and executives who spoke fluently about defense procurement processes. It was impressive, comprehensive, and exactly what you'd expect from a company with unlimited resources and decades of experience. Boeing's presentation emphasized their partnership with technology giants, showcasing cloud integration capabilities and artificial intelligence features that could predict communication failures before they occurred. They'd invested heavily in cutting-edge research and had prototype systems that demonstrated genuinely innovative approaches to military communications. Raytheon focused on their international partnerships and the strategic advantages of interoperability with NATO allies. Their system could seamlessly interface with communication networks used by European military forces, which was particularly valuable given the increasing emphasis on coalition operations in modern conflicts. Then came my turn to present on behalf of Apex Defense Solutions. I walked into that conference room knowing that I couldn't compete with my rivals on resources, corporate reputation, or political connections. But I had something they couldn't replicate: authentic understanding of how communication systems actually performed under the stress of real combat operations. So instead of starting with technical specifications or cost projections, I began with a story. I told them about a night in Helmand Province when my unit lost satellite contact during a firefight with Taliban forces. Our primary communication system failed due to atmospheric interference. The backup system was jammed by enemy electronic warfare equipment, and we spent 47 minutes unable to coordinate with artillery support or call for medical evacuation. 3 soldiers died that night, not because of superior enemy tactics or inadequate training, but because our communication technology couldn't maintain reliable connections when we needed it most. That story wasn't just emotional manipulation, it was the foundation for every technical decision reflected in my proposal. The redundant pathway algorithms weren't abstract engineering concepts. They were solutions to specific failures I'd witnessed in combat. The rapid deployment protocols weren't just convenient features. They were responses to operational constraints that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Over the next 3 hours, I walked the evaluation panel through every aspect of our system, demonstrating not just what it could do, but why those capabilities mattered in real-world military operations. When they asked about signal encryption, I explained how current systems created vulnerabilities that insurgent forces had learned to exploit. When they questioned manufacturing timelines, I showed them how our modular design approach could accelerate deployment while maintaining quality standards. The questions became increasingly technical, probing for weaknesses in our approach or gaps in our understanding. But 22 years of military experience had taught me to prepare for contingencies that others might overlook. I had backup solutions for every potential failure point, alternative approaches for every technical challenge, and real-world examples that illustrated why our design choices were superior to conventional approaches. By the end of that presentation, the room had transformed from polite skepticism to genuine engagement. General Rodriguez was taking detailed notes, the Pentagon's chief technology officer was asking about patent applications, and even the congressional liaison seemed impressed by the potential cost savings compared to traditional procurement approaches. 3 weeks later, I received the call that would change everything. Apex Defense Solutions had been selected as the primary contractor for the Unified Communications Initiative. The initial contract value was $2.8 billion over 7 years, with options for additional phases that could extend the total value beyond $5 billion. It was the largest contract in our company's history, the biggest communications technology deal in defense industry records, and validation that expertise could triumph over corporate size when applied with precision and authenticity. The announcement made headlines in Defense News, Federal Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Industry analysts called it the upset of the decade, comparing it to David defeating Goliath. but with implications that would reshape military communications for the next generation. Apex Defense Solutions went from being a mid-tier contractor to one of the most important companies in the defense industry overnight. But success in the defense industry creates its own challenges, and I was about to learn that winning the biggest contract in history was only the beginning of a much more complex and dangerous game. The news of our contract victory spread through the defense industry like wildfire, but the celebration at Apex felt strangely muted. Our CEO, Richard Hawthorne, had called an all-hands meeting for the morning after the official announcement, and I expected the kind of corporate fanfare that usually accompanied major wins: champagne, congratulatory speeches, maybe even a company-wide bonus announcement. Instead, I walked into a conference room filled with nervous energy and awkward silences. Hawthorne stood at the front of the room, but his usual commanding presence seemed diminished. He'd been running Apex for 12 years, building it from a startup into a respectable mid-tier contractor through careful relationship management and conservative business strategies. The $2.8 billion contract represented more revenue than the company had generated in its entire previous history, and the magnitude of that success seemed to overwhelm rather than energize him. "This is obviously tremendous news for all of us," he began, his voice lacking the enthusiasm you'd expect from someone who'd just landed the deal of a lifetime. "Victoria's work on the Unified Communications Initiative has put Apex on the map in ways we never imagined possible. The contract will require significant scaling of our operations, new hiring, expanded facilities, and partnerships with larger manufacturing companies." I sat in the front row, watching faces around the room as Hawthorne outlined the challenges ahead. Our engineering team looked excited but anxious about the technical complexity of delivering on such an ambitious timeline. The operations staff seemed overwhelmed by the logistics of scaling production capacity by a factor of 10. Even our accounting department appeared nervous about managing cash flow for a project that would dwarf our previous financial experience. But the most telling reaction came from our senior management team. Jennifer Walsh, our operations director, kept glancing at her phone during the presentation. David Chen nodded along with Hawthorne's comments, but his expression suggested someone processing bad news rather than celebrating success. And most notably, Marcus Sterling, our newly hired business development director, wasn't even present for what should have been the most important meeting in company history. Sterling had joined Apex just 6 weeks earlier, recruited from a senior position at Northrop Grumman with promises of expanding our government contracts and developing new market opportunities. His resume was impressive: MBA from Wharton, 15 years in defense industry business development, and a network of Pentagon connections that allegedly gave him insight into upcoming procurement opportunities. I'd been skeptical of Sterling from our first meeting. His background was purely corporate, with no military experience or technical expertise in communication systems. He spoke fluently about market positioning and competitive strategies, but seemed uncomfortable discussing the operational realities that drove military procurement decisions. More concerning, he'd immediately begun questioning our approach to the Unified Communications Initiative, suggesting that we should consider partnering with larger contractors who could provide additional credibility to our proposal. During the contract development process, Sterling had pushed for bringing in Raytheon as a subcontractor, arguing that their involvement would reduce technical risk and improve our chances of winning the competition. I'd resisted that suggestion, knowing that involving a major competitor would inevitably result in losing control of our most valuable innovations. The mesh network algorithms and adaptive encryption protocols that made our system superior were precisely the kind of intellectual property that larger companies would absorb and replicate for their own future proposals. Now, with the contract officially awarded, Sterling's absence from the celebration meeting felt deliberately calculated rather than coincidental. When I asked Hawthorne about it afterward, he mentioned that Sterling was handling some urgent business development matters, but provided no additional details. The evasiveness of that response triggered the same instincts that had kept me alive during combat deployments. Something was happening beneath the surface that I wasn't seeing clearly. Over the next 2 weeks, Sterling's influence within the company became increasingly apparent and increasingly troubling. He'd scheduled private meetings with key department heads, ostensibly to discuss scaling strategies for the new contract. But according to conversations I had with David Chen and Jennifer Walsh, those meetings focused more on organizational restructuring than operational planning. Sterling was advocating for bringing in external consultants to manage different aspects of the contract implementation. He'd identified potential partnerships with established defense contractors who could handle manufacturing, quality assurance, and Pentagon liaison responsibilities. His argument was that Apex lacked the institutional knowledge and corporate infrastructure to successfully deliver on such a massive contract without experienced partners. On the surface, these suggestions seemed reasonable. A $2.8 billion contract would definitely strain our existing capabilities, and partnering with larger companies could provide access to resources and expertise that would be difficult to develop internally. But having spent 22 years in organizations where bureaucratic maneuvering could be as dangerous as enemy fire, I recognized the warning signs of a corporate takeover, disguised as collaborative support. The first concrete indication of Sterling's true agenda came during a strategy meeting that Hawthorne had scheduled to discuss contract implementation timelines. The meeting included Sterling, myself, David Chen, Jennifer Walsh, and 2 external consultants that Sterling had brought in to provide independent assessment of our operational readiness. The consultants, introduced as experts in defense contract management, spent the first hour of the meeting highlighting potential risks and challenges associated with the Unified Communications Initiative. They questioned our manufacturing capacity, our quality control processes, our Pentagon relationships, and our financial reserves for handling unexpected cost overruns. Every concern they raised was legitimate, but their presentation felt like a deliberate attempt to undermine confidence in our ability to succeed. Sterling then presented his recommended solution, a strategic partnership with Meridian Defense Group, a subsidiary of Northrop Grumman that specialized in complex systems integration for military contracts. Under his proposed arrangement, Meridian would handle manufacturing, quality assurance, Pentagon liaison, and contract administration, while Apex would provide technical expertise and retain intellectual property rights to our innovations. The SAM partnership terms seemed favorable on paper. Apex would maintain majority ownership of the contract and receive the largest share of profits, while Meridian would assume operational responsibility for areas where we lacked experience. But I'd seen similar arrangements during my military career, and I knew how quickly partnerships could evolve into acquisitions when larger companies gained operational control over critical contract elements. When I voiced these concerns, Sterling's response was smoothly dismissive. He acknowledged that partnerships always involved some risk, but argued that attempting to fulfill such a massive contract independently would be far more dangerous. He presented financial projections showing how cost overruns or delivery delays could bankrupt Apex if we tried to scale our operations too quickly without experienced guidance. Hawthorne seemed genuinely torn between the 2 approaches. He'd built Apex by taking calculated risks and maintaining independence from larger competitors, but he also recognized that the Unified Communications Initiative represented a scale of complexity that exceeded our previous experience. The prospect of potentially losing everything by attempting too much too quickly was a legitimate concern that couldn't be dismissed lightly. The meeting ended without a definitive decision, but Sterling's influence was clearly growing. Over the following days, he scheduled additional meetings with our financial advisors, legal counsel, and board members to discuss partnership options. He brought in more external consultants to assess our operational readiness, each of whom identified additional risks and challenges that could be mitigated through strategic partnerships. Meanwhile, I was working 18-hour days on the technical aspects of contract implementation. The Pentagon had scheduled a series of design review meetings to finalize system specifications, and I was coordinating with our engineering team to develop detailed implementation plans. The work was demanding but energizing. This was exactly the kind of challenge I'd trained for throughout my military career, the opportunity to solve complex problems with real-world impact. But the political dynamics within Apex were becoming increasingly distracting. Sterling had begun positioning himself as the primary point of contact for external partners and Pentagon officials, despite having no technical expertise in communication systems and limited understanding of our contract requirements. He was scheduling meetings without including me, making commitments to timeline and deliverables without consulting our engineering team, and presenting himself as the strategic leader responsible for our contract success. The situation reached a critical point during a Pentagon briefing that Sterling had arranged without my knowledge. I discovered the meeting only because General Rodriguez's office contacted me directly to confirm technical details that Sterling apparently couldn't address during their previous conversation. When I asked Hawthorne about the meeting, he seemed surprised that I hadn't been included, but Sterling explained that he'd wanted to handle strategic positioning before involving technical staff in detailed discussions. That explanation might have been acceptable if Sterling had actually understood our technical capabilities and contract requirements. But when I reviewed his meeting notes and follow-up emails, it became clear that he'd made several commitments that were either impossible to fulfill or potentially compromising to our intellectual property protections. He'd suggested that our system specifications could be modified to accommodate Pentagon requests that would actually undermine the core innovations that made our approach superior to competitor alternatives. More troubling, he'd indicated to Pentagon officials that Apex was open to sharing technical details with strategic partners who might contribute to contract fulfillment. This suggestion directly contradicted our intellectual property strategy and could potentially give competitors access to the innovations that had won us the contract in the first place. When I confronted Sterling about these issues, his response revealed the true nature of his agenda. He argued that my military mindset was too rigid for the collaborative approach required in modern defense contracting. According to his assessment, I was too protective of technical details and too suspicious of potential partners who could provide valuable support for contract fulfillment. He suggested that my role should focus on technical development while he handled business strategy and Pentagon relationships. This division of responsibilities would allow me to concentrate on engineering challenges without being distracted by political and commercial considerations that required different expertise. The proposal sounded reasonable, but I recognized it as a classic maneuver to marginalize someone's influence while appearing to respect their contributions. Sterling was positioning himself as the strategic leader, while relegating me to a technical support role, despite the fact that my military experience and Pentagon relationships had been crucial to winning the contract in the first place. As I sat in my office that evening, reviewing Sterling's emails and meeting notes, I realized that I was facing a threat that was potentially more dangerous than anything I'd encountered during 4 combat deployments. At least in Afghanistan, enemies identified themselves clearly and attacked directly. But Sterling was using corporate politics and bureaucratic maneuvering to undermine my position while maintaining the appearance of collaborative leadership. The battle for control of the Unified Communications Initiative was just beginning, and I was about to discover that surviving corporate warfare would require skills that weren't taught in any military training program. The morning I decided to confront the situation directly started like any other Tuesday, except for the email that arrived at 6:47 a.m. from General Rodriguez's office. The subject line read, "Urgent. Technical clarification required. UCI implementation." As I opened the message, my coffee grew cold while I absorbed the implications of what I was reading. According to the email, Sterling had scheduled another Pentagon meeting for later that week to discuss revised implementation strategies for the Unified Communications Initiative. The general's staff was requesting technical documentation that Sterling had apparently promised during their previous conversation, including detailed schematics of our mesh network algorithms and encryption protocols. Most concerning, they were expecting answers to questions about potential system modifications that could accommodate allied partner integration requirements. I stared at the screen, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest that used to precede combat operations. Sterling was not only making technical commitments without consulting me, but he was potentially compromising the core innovations that gave our system its competitive advantage. The mesh network algorithms had taken me 2 years to develop, and the adaptive encryption protocols were the result of insights gained from analyzing enemy communication interception attempts during my deployments in Afghanistan. The idea of sharing these technical details with allied partners sounded innocuous enough in corporate speak, but I understood the implications. Once our proprietary algorithms were documented and distributed for compatibility assessment, they would inevitably find their way to competitors who could reverse engineer our innovations for their own systems. Sterling was essentially proposing to give away the intellectual property that had won us the largest contract in defense industry history. I forwarded the email to David Chen and Jennifer Walsh, requesting an emergency meeting to discuss our response strategy. Within an hour, we were gathered in the small conference room adjacent to my office, reviewing the technical commitments that Sterling had apparently made without any understanding of their implications. David's reaction was immediate and visceral. These modifications would completely undermine the system architecture, he said, pointing to specific requirements that Sterling had agreed to provide. The mesh network depends on proprietary node authentication protocols that can't be shared without compromising security for the entire system. If we modify the algorithms to accommodate external integration, we're essentially creating backdoors that could be exploited by hostile actors. Jennifer's concerns focused on the operational implications. Even if we could somehow modify the system without compromising security, the timeline Sterling proposed is completely unrealistic. We're talking about fundamental changes to algorithms that have already been tested and validated through months of Pentagon review. Starting over with modified specifications would delay implementation by at least 18 months, which violates our contract delivery commitments. The more we analyzed Sterling's commitments, the clearer it became that he was operating from a fundamental misunderstanding of both our technical capabilities and our contractual obligations. He seemed to view the Unified Communications Initiative as a generic technology project that could be modified and adapted according to political considerations, rather than a precisely engineered system designed to meet specific military requirements. Decided that the situation required direct intervention before Sterling could make additional commitments that would be impossible to fulfill. That afternoon, I requested a meeting with Hawthorne to discuss coordination of Pentagon communications and technical decision-making authority. My goal was to establish clear boundaries around who could make commitments related to system specifications and implementation timelines. Hawthorne's office felt different that day, somehow smaller and more corporate than I remembered. He'd recently redecorated with expensive furniture and abstract artwork that seemed designed to impress visitors rather than create a productive working environment. As I sat across from his imposing desk, I noticed that the military commendations and technical achievement awards that had previously decorated his walls had been replaced with generic corporate leadership certificates and industry recognition plaques. "Victoria, I'm glad you wanted to meet," Hawthorne began, but his tone suggested someone preparing to deliver unwelcome news rather than engage in collaborative problem-solving. "I've been meaning to discuss some organizational adjustments that will help us manage the complexity of the UCI contract more effectively." The phrase organizational adjustments immediately triggered my defensive instincts. In military terminology, that kind of bureaucratic language usually preceded announcements about personnel reassignments or command structure changes that would remove experienced leaders from critical positions. Hawthorne continued without waiting for my response. Marcus has been developing some innovative partnership strategies that could significantly enhance our capabilities and reduce the operational risks associated with such a large contract. His experience with complex defense industry relationships gives him insights that could be invaluable for managing Pentagon communications and stakeholder expectations. I kept my expression neutral while processing the implications of what I was hearing. Hawthorne was positioning Sterling's corporate maneuvering as strategic thinking and framing his lack of technical expertise as a beneficial perspective. This was exactly the kind of bureaucratic reasoning that had frustrated me during my final years in the military, when decision-making authority was increasingly transferred from experienced operators to administrators who prioritized political considerations over operational effectiveness. "Richard," I said, using his first name deliberately to emphasize the directness of my response, "Sterling has been making technical commitments to Pentagon officials without understanding our system capabilities or contractual obligations. His latest meeting resulted in requests for documentation that could compromise our intellectual property and modifications that would fundamentally undermine our system architecture." Hawthorne's response revealed how completely Sterling had managed to influence his perspective. "I understand your concerns about protecting our technical innovations, but we also need to consider the broader strategic implications of this contract. The Pentagon is dealing with political pressure to ensure that major defense contracts provide maximum value for taxpayer investment. That means demonstrating flexibility and collaboration with allied partners, even if it requires some adjustments to our original technical specifications." The casual way he dismissed the importance of our technical specifications was both infuriating and illuminating. Hawthorne was talking about adjustments to innovations that had required years of development and represented the core competitive advantages of our entire system. He seemed to view our proprietary algorithms as negotiable details rather than fundamental elements that determined whether the system would actually work in combat situations. I tried a different approach, focusing on the practical implications rather than the technical details. The modifications Sterling discussed would delay implementation by at least 18 months and potentially compromise system security in ways that could endanger military personnel who depend on reliable communications during combat operations. These aren't abstract technical concerns. They're factors that could directly impact mission success and soldier safety. Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, adopting the kind of patronizing expression that corporate executives use when they think subordinates are being unnecessarily emotional about business decisions. "Victoria, I appreciate your passion for technical excellence, and nobody questions your expertise in communication systems. But managing a $2.8 billion contract requires balancing multiple considerations that extend beyond pure technical performance. Sterling brings a strategic perspective that complements your technical skills, and I think the combination could be very powerful." The phrase, "balancing multiple considerations," was corporate speak for compromising technical integrity in favor of political expediency. I'd heard similar language from Pentagon administrators who justified inadequate equipment procurement by citing budget constraints and contractor relationships. The result was always the same. Soldiers in the field received equipment that looked impressive in presentations but failed when lives depended on reliable performance. I realized that Hawthorne had already made his decision about organizational changes, and this meeting was intended to announce those changes rather than discuss them. Sterling's influence had convinced him that corporate deal-making was more valuable than technical expertise, despite the fact that technical innovation had been the foundation of our contract success. "What specific organizational adjustments are you considering?" I asked, deciding to force him to be explicit about his intentions, rather than continuing to speak in euphemisms. Hawthorne's answer confirmed my worst fears. "We're going to restructure the UCI project management to better leverage everyone's strengths. Sterling will take over as project director, handling Pentagon communications, stakeholder relationships, and strategic planning. You'll continue as technical lead, focusing on system development and engineering coordination. David will report to you on technical matters, while Jennifer will work with Sterling on operational planning and contractor relationships. The proposed structure was a classic corporate maneuver designed to marginalize someone's authority while maintaining the appearance of respecting their expertise. Sterling would control all external communications and strategic decisions, while I would be relegated to internal technical management with no input on how our innovations were presented to Pentagon officials or potential partners. More importantly, the structure would give Sterling authority to make commitments about technical capabilities and implementation timelines without requiring my approval or even my consultation. He could promise system modifications, agree to intellectual property sharing arrangements, or commit to delivery schedules that were technically impossible, and I would be expected to find ways to fulfill those commitments regardless of their feasibility. Richard, this structure puts someone with no technical expertise in charge of making decisions that could determine whether our system actually works in combat situations. Sterling doesn't understand the implications of the commitments he's already made, and giving him authority to make additional commitments could result in contractual obligations that are impossible to fulfill. Hawthorne's response revealed how completely Sterling had managed to reframe the narrative around our contract success. Marcus has 15 years of experience managing complex defense contracts, and his track record of successful Pentagon relationships speaks for itself. Your technical expertise is obviously crucial, but managing stakeholder expectations and political considerations requires different skills that Marcus brings to the team. The irony was almost overwhelming. Sterling's successful Pentagon relationships had contributed nothing to winning the Unified Communications Initiative contract. His expertise in managing stakeholder expectations consisted of making promises that he couldn't keep and commitments that he couldn't fulfill. But somehow, Hawthorne had been convinced that corporate maneuvering was more valuable than the technical innovations and military relationships that had actually won us the contract. Made one final attempt to explain the practical implications of the proposed changes. The Pentagon awarded this contract based on specific technical capabilities and implementation strategies that I developed through years of military experience and engineering expertise. Allowing someone without that background to modify our approach or make commitments about system capabilities is like giving someone who's never flown a plane authority to redesign aircraft controls during flight. Hawthorne's patience was clearly wearing thin. Victoria, I understand that this represents a significant change in your role, but organizational evolution is necessary for managing growth and complexity. Sterling's involvement will allow you to focus on what you do best, technical development, while ensuring that our business strategy aligns with Pentagon expectations and industry best practices. The meeting was clearly over. Hawthorne had already decided to implement Sterling's organizational structure, and my objections were being treated as resistance to necessary change rather than legitimate concerns about technical and operational integrity. As I walked back to my office, I realized that I was facing a situation that required strategic thinking rather than direct confrontation. Sterling had successfully positioned himself as the solution to problems that he had largely created himself. His lack of technical expertise had been reframed as strategic perspective. His inability to understand our system had been presented as flexibility, and his tendency to make unrealistic commitments had been characterized as effective stakeholder management. But I had advantages that Sterling couldn't replicate or neutralize through corporate maneuvering. I understood every aspect of our technical system. I had direct relationships with Pentagon officials who understood the operational importance of our innovations, and I had documentation of every technical decision and design choice that had made our contract proposal successful. More importantly, I knew that Sterling's approach would inevitably result in technical failures or contractual violations that would expose his incompetence to Pentagon officials who valued operational effectiveness over corporate presentations. The challenge was positioning myself to survive the organizational changes while maintaining the ability to respond when Sterling's limitations became apparent to everyone else. That evening, I began developing a strategy that would protect our technical innovations while documenting Sterling's commitments and decisions for future reference. I wasn't planning to sabotage his efforts, but I was determined to ensure that his failures wouldn't be attributed to technical inadequacies or engineering mistakes. The battle for control of the Unified Communications Initiative was entering a new phase, and I was preparing for a longer and more complex campaign than I had initially anticipated. The restructuring announcement came on a Thursday morning, delivered through the kind of sterile company-wide email that corporate executives use when they want to present major changes as routine administrative updates. The subject line read, Organizational Enhancement, UCI Project Leadership Structure, and the tone was relentlessly positive, filled with phrases like leveraging synergies and optimizing expertise alignment. According to the official announcement, the changes were designed to maximize project success through strategic role optimization. Sterling was named UCI Project Director, responsible for strategic oversight, stakeholder engagement, and Pentagon liaison coordination. I was designated as Senior Technical Architect, focused on system development, engineering excellence, and technical implementation. The language made it sound like a promotion, but anyone with corporate experience would recognize it as a carefully worded demotion. The email was copied to everyone at Apex, ensuring that my reduced authority would be visible across the entire organization. It was a classic corporate power play, designed to establish Sterling's dominance while making it difficult for me to object, without appearing to resist necessary organizational improvements. The timing was particularly calculated. Sterling was scheduled to represent Apex at a major defense industry conference the following week, where he would be introduced as the project director responsible for our historic contract victory. What made the announcement even more insulting was the attribution of credit for the UCI contract success. The email referenced Sterling's strategic leadership in developing innovative partnership approaches and his instrumental role in positioning Apex for unprecedented growth opportunities. My contribution was acknowledged through generic language about technical expertise and engineering support, as if the innovations that had won the contract were merely implementation details rather than the foundation of our competitive advantage. I sat at my desk, reading the announcement multiple times while fighting the urge to immediately storm into Hawthorne's office and demand an explanation. 22 years of military training had taught me the importance of controlling emotional reactions during crisis situations, but this felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any enemy attack I'd experienced during combat deployments. At least in Afghanistan, the people trying to kill me were honest about their intentions. The responses from my colleagues were swift and revealing. David Chen stopped by my office within an hour, looking uncomfortable and apologetic. Victoria, I just wanted you to know that I had no advance warning about this announcement. Sterling approached me last week about reporting structure optimization, but I had no idea he was planning to take over the project. Jennifer Walsh's reaction was more direct and more angry. This is complete bullshit, she said, closing my office door before continuing. Sterling has been here for 2 months and doesn't understand the first thing about our technical capabilities or contract requirements. How the hell is he qualified to represent us to Pentagon officials who expect detailed technical knowledge about our system innovations? But the most telling response came from our engineering team. Within hours of the announcement, I received a series of private messages from engineers who had worked on the UCI proposal, expressing confusion and concern about the leadership changes. They understood that Sterling lacked the technical background to make informed decisions about system development, and they were worried about how his involvement would affect their ability to deliver on our contract commitments. The consensus among the technical staff was clear. Sterling's appointment as project director represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what had made our contract proposal successful. Our victory hadn't been achieved through corporate maneuvering or strategic partnerships. It had been the result of technical innovations that addressed real operational problems identified through military experience. Replacing that expertise with generic business development skills seemed like a recipe for disaster. Over the next few days, Sterling wasted no time in asserting his new authority. He scheduled meetings with every department head to discuss strategic alignment and operational optimization. He brought in additional external consultants to assess our project management processes and recommend improvements. Most significantly, he began reaching out to Pentagon officials to introduce himself as the new primary point of contact for all UCI-related communications. I learned about Sterling's Pentagon outreach through a phone call from Colonel Janet Morrison, the deputy director of the Defense Communications Agency, who had been involved in our contract evaluation process. She called me directly, which was unusual given the formal protocols that typically governed contractor communications with Pentagon officials. Victoria, I'm calling because we received some confusing information from your new project director about potential modifications to the UCI system specifications, Colonel Morrison said. Marcus Sterling contacted our office yesterday with questions about integrating commercial satellite networks that aren't compatible with our security requirements. When we explained that such integration would violate classified system protocols, he suggested that your technical team could develop workarounds that would maintain security while enabling broader compatibility. The colonel's tone suggested someone trying to remain diplomatically neutral, while expressing serious concerns about what she'd heard. I wanted to check with you directly before responding to his requests, because the modifications he's proposing seem to contradict fundamental aspects of your original proposal. Could you clarify whether Apex is actually recommending changes to the system architecture that we've already approved and begun implementing? I felt my stomach drop as I absorbed the implications of what Colonel Morrison was telling me. Sterling had not only contacted Pentagon officials without coordinating with me, but he had proposed technical modifications that demonstrated a complete misunderstanding of our system requirements and security protocols. Worse, he had implied that our engineering team could simply develop workarounds for fundamental incompatibilities, as if classified system security was a minor technical detail that could be adjusted for commercial convenience. Colonel Morrison, I can assure you that Apex is not recommending any changes to the approved system architecture, I replied, choosing my words carefully to avoid directly contradicting Sterling while clarifying our actual technical position. The system specifications we provided during the contract evaluation process represent the optimal approach for meeting your operational requirements while maintaining the security protocols required for classified communications. The colonel's relief was audible. That's what I expected to hear, but Sterling's suggestions were concerning enough that I felt I needed to verify our understanding directly with your technical team. Can you ensure that any future communications about potential system modifications go through appropriate technical review before being presented to Pentagon officials? I promised to coordinate more closely with Sterling on Pentagon communications, knowing that I was making a commitment that would be difficult to fulfill given my reduced authority within the new organizational structure. But I also understood that maintaining Pentagon confidence in our technical competence was more important than navigating internal corporate politics. After ending the call with Colonel Morrison, I immediately contacted Sterling to discuss the Pentagon communication that had prompted her concern. His response revealed both his fundamental misunderstanding of our technical requirements and his casual dismissal of my expertise in military systems procurement. Victoria, I appreciate your concern about protocol, but you need to understand that managing Pentagon relationships requires a broader perspective than purely technical considerations, Sterling said, using the kind of condescending tone that corporate executives adopt when they think subordinates are being unnecessarily detailed about operational issues. The modifications I discussed with Colonel Morrison are strategic options that could expand our market opportunities and demonstrate flexibility in meeting evolving Pentagon requirements. When I explained that his proposed modifications would violate classified system security protocols and potentially compromise the operational effectiveness that had made our proposal successful, Sterling's response was dismissive. Security protocols can always be adjusted through appropriate channels, and operational effectiveness is determined by meeting stakeholder expectations rather than adhering rigidly to original technical specifications. The conversation revealed that Sterling viewed our technical innovations as starting points for negotiation, rather than carefully engineered solutions to specific military problems. He seemed to believe that system security, operational effectiveness, and contract deliverables were flexible parameters that could be modified according to business opportunities and stakeholder preferences. More troubling, he appeared to consider my military experience and technical expertise as obstacles to the kind of strategic flexibility that he believed was necessary for maximizing commercial opportunities. When I pointed out that Pentagon officials valued technical competence and operational understanding over corporate presentation skills, Sterling suggested that my military mindset was too rigid for the collaborative approach required in modern defense contracting. The following week brought additional evidence of Sterling's impact on our Pentagon relationships. I received messages from 3 different Pentagon officials expressing confusion about communications they had received from Apex regarding potential partnerships, system modifications, and timeline adjustments that contradicted information they had received during our original contract proposal process. General Rodriguez's office sent a formal inquiry requesting clarification about whether Apex was experiencing technical difficulties that might affect our ability to deliver on contract commitments. The inquiry referenced conversations with Sterling in which he had allegedly discussed contingency planning and risk mitigation strategies that implied potential problems with our system development progress. The Defense Communications Agency requested updated technical documentation that Sterling had apparently promised during a meeting that I hadn't attended or even known about. The documentation they were expecting included detailed schematics of proprietary algorithms and encryption protocols that were specifically protected under our intellectual property agreements with Apex. Most concerning, the Pentagon's contract. Management Office scheduled a formal review meeting to assess our project status and address stakeholder concerns that had been raised through recent communications with our project leadership. The meeting was described as a routine check-in, but the formal tone and short notice suggested that Pentagon officials were concerned about our ability to fulfill contract obligations. I realized that Sterling's corporate maneuvering and strategic repositioning were creating exactly the kind of problems that he claimed to be solving. His attempts to demonstrate flexibility and collaboration were being interpreted by Pentagon officials as indicators of technical uncertainty and organizational instability. His efforts to expand partnership opportunities were raising questions about our commitment to protecting classified information and maintaining system security. The irony was profound. Sterling had been positioned as someone who could manage Pentagon relationships more effectively than a former military officer with decades of defense industry experience. But his corporate approach to stakeholder management was actually undermining the confidence and trust that I had spent years building with the same Pentagon officials who had awarded us the largest contract in defense industry history. As I prepared for the formal review meeting that Sterling's communications had triggered, I understood that I was facing a critical decision point. I could continue trying to work within the organizational structure that Hawthorne had imposed, accepting my reduced authority while attempting to limit the damage that Sterling's incompetence was causing to our Pentagon relationships. Or I could take a more direct approach to protecting the contract that represented not only my professional legacy, but also the technological innovations that could save lives in future military operations. The meeting with Pentagon officials would determine whether Sterling's strategic leadership was actually advancing Apex's interests or systematically destroying the foundation of trust and technical competence that had made our contract victory possible. Either way, I was prepared to ensure that military personnel wouldn't suffer the consequences of corporate politics and strategic repositioning that prioritized business development over operational effectiveness. The stakes had never been higher, and the margin for error was rapidly disappearing. The Pentagon review meeting was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Conference Room 3E876, a windowless space deep within the maze of corridors that most civilians never see. I arrived 30 minutes early, carrying a briefcase filled with technical documentation, contract specifications, and communication records that I'd meticulously organized over the previous weekend. Sterling arrived precisely on time, accompanied by two consultants from Meridian Defense Group, who he introduced as strategic advisors, without explaining why external consultants were attending a routine project review. The Pentagon attendees included Colonel Morrison, General Rodriguez, two representatives from the Defense Communications Agency, a contract compliance officer, and a senior acquisitions specialist whose presence suggested that this meeting was anything but routine. The formal nature of the gathering became apparent when the contract compliance officer began the session by reading from prepared notes about contractor communication protocols and technical specification adherence requirements. General Rodriguez opened the substantive discussion with a directness that I recognized from military briefings, where serious problems needed immediate resolution. Mr. Sterling, we've received conflicting information about Apex's technical capabilities and implementation timeline that requires clarification. Your recent communications have suggested potential system modifications and partnership arrangements that weren't part of our original contract evaluation. We need to understand whether these represent actual changes to your technical approach or miscommunications about your existing capabilities. Sterling's response demonstrated exactly why Pentagon officials were concerned about his communications. Instead of providing clear, factual answers about our technical specifications, he launched into a presentation about adaptive strategic positioning and collaborative optimization opportunities that sounded impressive but provided no concrete information about our actual system capabilities or implementation plans. General Rodriguez, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify Apex's strategic vision for the UCI implementation, Sterling began, using the kind of corporate presentation voice that immediately signals insincerity to anyone with military experience. Our approach emphasizes flexibility and partnership collaboration that can maximize value delivery while ensuring optimal stakeholder satisfaction across all operational parameters. I watched the Pentagon officials exchange glances as Sterling continued his presentation, using buzzwords and corporate jargon to avoid answering the specific technical questions they had raised. Colonel Morrison's expression suggested someone listening to a used car salesman trying to explain why the engine wasn't working properly. The Defense Communications Agency representatives were taking notes, but their body language indicated increasing frustration with Sterling's evasiveness. After 15 minutes of Sterling's strategic positioning discussion, General Rodriguez interrupted with the kind of decisive intervention that military officers use when briefings are wasting valuable time. Mr. Sterling, let me be more specific about our concerns. In your communication with Colonel Morrison last week, you suggested that Apex could modify the mesh network algorithms to accommodate commercial satellite integration. This modification would require changes to classified encryption protocols that are fundamental to the system's security architecture. Are you actually proposing to alter the technical specifications that we've already approved and begun implementing? Sterling's answer revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about both our technical capabilities and Pentagon security requirements. General, I believe there are always opportunities for creative solutions that can enhance system capabilities while maintaining appropriate security standards. Our technical team is exceptionally skilled at developing innovative approaches that can meet evolving requirements through collaborative problem-solving and strategic partnerships. The silence that followed Sterling's response was deafening. Everyone in the room understood that he had essentially admitted to proposing changes to classified systems without understanding the security implications or technical feasibility of those changes. Worse, he had implied that security protocols were negotiable parameters, rather than absolute requirements that determined whether the system would be acceptable for military use. Colonel Morrison's next question cut directly to the core of Pentagon, concerns about Sterling's involvement in the project. Mr. Sterling, do you have security clearance to access the classified technical specifications that would be required for the modifications you've been discussing? Sterling's pause before answering revealed that he hadn't even considered the security clearance requirements for the technical decisions he'd been proposing. Colonel Morrison, my role focuses on strategic coordination and partnership development rather than detailed technical implementation. I work closely with Victoria and our technical team to ensure that any proposed modifications are properly evaluated through appropriate channels. That answer was both factually incorrect and strategically disastrous. Sterling had been making technical commitments and proposing system modifications without consulting me or our engineering team, and everyone in the room now understood that he lacked the security clearance necessary to access the information required for informed decision-making about classified systems. General Rodriguez turned to me with the kind of direct eye contact that military officers use when they need straight answers from subordinates. Ms. Carter, as Senior Technical Architect, can you clarify Apex's actual position regarding system modifications and partnership arrangements? Are you recommending changes to the approved technical specifications, and if so, what is the technical justification for those changes? I had spent the previous week preparing for exactly this question, knowing that Sterling's communications had created confusion that could only be resolved through clear, factual explanations of our technical position. My response needed to clarify our actual capabilities while avoiding direct criticism of Sterling that could damage Apex's relationship with Pentagon officials. General Rodriguez, Apex is not recommending any changes to the approved UCI technical specifications, I said, speaking with the precision that military audiences expect from technical briefings. The mesh network algorithms and encryption protocols that we proposed during the contract evaluation process represent the optimal solution for meeting your operational requirements while maintaining the security standards required for classified communications. Any modifications to these core systems would require extensive re-engineering and retesting that would significantly delay implementation and potentially compromise operational effectiveness. The relief in the room was immediate and obvious. Pentagon officials had been concerned that Apex was experiencing technical difficulties or attempting to renegotiate fundamental aspects of a contract that had already been finalized through months of detailed evaluation. My clarification confirmed that our technical approach remained unchanged and that the confusion had resulted from miscommunication rather than actual problems with system development. Colonel Morrison's follow-up question addressed the partnership arrangements that Sterling had been discussing with various Pentagon offices. Ms. Carter, can you explain the role of Meridian Defense Group in your implementation plans? Mr. Sterling has referenced potential partnerships that could affect technical oversight and quality assurance responsibilities. This question put me in an extremely difficult position. Sterling had been negotiating partnership arrangements without my involvement or approval, but I couldn't directly contradict him without appearing insubordinate or creating public conflict that would damage Apex's reputation with Pentagon officials. My response needed to be factually accurate while maintaining professional courtesy toward Sterling's position. Colonel Morrison, Meridian Defense Group has been engaged as a consultant to assess our manufacturing capacity and quality assurance processes, I replied, choosing my words carefully to provide accurate information without endorsing Sterling's broader partnership strategy. Any formal partnership arrangements would require detailed technical evaluation to ensure compatibility with our system architecture and contract obligations. As Senior Technical Architect, I would be involved in assessing the technical implications of any proposed partnerships before implementation. Sterling clearly understood that my response had undermined his authority to make unilateral decisions about partnerships, but the presence of Pentagon officials prevented him from directly challenging my technical assessment. Instead, he attempted to reframe the discussion around strategic considerations that he believed demonstrated his value to the project. I want to emphasize that our partnership evaluations are focused on maximizing delivery capabilities and ensuring optimal resource allocation, Sterling said, returning to the corporate presentation voice that had already failed to impress the Pentagon audience. Meridian brings extensive experience in defense contract management that could provide valuable support for quality assurance and stakeholder coordination. General Rodriguez's response demonstrated why military officers often find corporate executives frustrating to work with. Mr. Sterling, our primary concern is technical performance and delivery timeline adherence, not stakeholder coordination or strategic positioning. We awarded this contract based on specific technical capabilities that Ms. Carter's team demonstrated during the evaluation process. Any changes to technical oversight or partnership arrangements that could affect those capabilities require our approval before implementation. The General's statement was a clear directive that Sterling couldn't ignore without directly violating Pentagon requirements. More importantly, it established that any future technical decisions required my involvement and Pentagon approval, effectively limiting Sterling's authority to make unilateral commitments about system specifications or partnership arrangements. The meeting concluded with specific action items that further constrained Sterling's ability to create confusion through unauthorized communications. All technical discussions with Pentagon officials would require my participation or prior approval. Any proposed partnerships or system modifications would need formal technical assessment and Pentagon review before implementation. Future project communications would follow established protocols that ensured technical accuracy and consistency with approved contract specifications. As we left the Pentagon building, Sterling's demeanor had shifted from confident presentation to barely controlled frustration. The consultants from Meridian Defense Group seemed uncomfortable and uncertain about their role in future project activities. Most significantly, Sterling understood that his authority to represent Apex in technical discussions had been effectively eliminated by the Pentagon's communication protocols. During the drive back to Apex headquarters, Sterling made his position clear through a conversation that felt more like a threat than a strategic discussion. Victoria, I understand that you have concerns about partnership arrangements and technical modifications, but you need to consider the broader implications of your resistance to strategic flexibility. Pentagon relationships require diplomatic management that balances technical requirements with political considerations that extend beyond pure engineering concerns. His tone suggested someone who believed that my technical expertise was an obstacle to his business development objectives rather than the foundation of our contract success. More troubling, he seemed to view Pentagon communication protocols as bureaucratic inconveniences rather than security requirements that protected classified information and ensured operational effectiveness. Marcus, the Pentagon protocols exist because technical accuracy is essential for maintaining their confidence in our capabilities, I replied, attempting to explain why his approach was counterproductive without directly challenging his authority. Military officials value precision and reliability over flexibility and strategic positioning, especially when dealing with systems that could affect soldier safety and mission success. Sterling's response revealed the fundamental disconnect between his corporate background and the military culture that governed Pentagon procurement decisions. Victoria, you're thinking like an engineer rather than a business leader. Success in defense contracting requires understanding political dynamics and stakeholder management techniques that go beyond technical specifications and operational requirements. As we pulled into the Apex parking lot, I realized that Sterling's commitment to strategic flexibility would inevitably create additional problems with Pentagon officials who expected technical competence and straightforward communication. His belief that political considerations should override technical requirements represented exactly the kind of thinking that resulted in inadequate equipment procurement and operational failures that endangered military personnel. The Pentagon review meeting had temporarily constrained Sterling's ability to make unauthorized technical commitments, but it had also intensified his determination to assert authority over project strategy and partnership decisions. The conflict, between his business development priorities and my technical responsibilities, was escalating toward a confrontation that would determine not only the future of the UCI contract, but also the direction of Apex's relationship with Pentagon officials, who valued operational effectiveness over corporate maneuvering. The stakes were becoming clearer with each interaction, and I was beginning to understand that protecting the integrity of our technical innovations would require strategies that extended beyond simply correcting Sterling's mistakes and miscommunications. The breaking point came exactly 3 weeks after the Pentagon review meeting, delivered through an email that arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday night. The subject line read, "Immediate action required, contract restructuring," and the sender was Marcus Sterling. I opened it while reviewing technical documentation for our Monday morning engineering meeting, expecting routine project updates or scheduling changes. Instead, I found a message that fundamentally altered everything I thought I understood about Sterling's intentions and Hawthorne's commitment to our original contract approach. The email was copied to Hawthorne, the entire senior management team, and several external recipients whose email addresses I didn't recognize, but whose corporate domains indicated affiliations with major defense contractors, including Northrop, Grumman, and Raytheon. Effective immediately, Apex Defense Solutions will be implementing a strategic restructuring of the UCI contract to optimize delivery capabilities and ensure stakeholder satisfaction, the email began, using the kind of formal corporate language that typically precedes major organizational changes. After extensive consultation with Pentagon officials and industry partners, we have determined that fulfilling our contract obligations requires expanded partnership arrangements and modified technical approaches that leverage proven industry capabilities. The email went on to detail partnership agreements that Sterling had apparently negotiated without my knowledge or involvement. Meridian Defense Group would assume responsibility for technical oversight and quality assurance, while Raytheon would provide systems integration and Pentagon liaison services. Most shocking, Northrop Grumman would handle intellectual property, management, and future contract development. According to Sterling's restructuring plan, my role would be modified to senior technical consultant, responsible for providing legacy system knowledge and transitional support during the partnership implementation phase. The language was carefully crafted to make the changes sound like career advancement, but anyone with corporate experience would recognize it as a systematic elimination of my authority and eventual removal from the project entirely. The email concluded with a timeline that revealed the calculated nature of Sterling's approach. The partnership agreements had already been signed, the Pentagon had been notified of the organizational changes, and the technical transition would begin within 48 hours. I was being presented with a fait accompli, rather than consulted, about strategic decisions that would determine the future of innovations I had developed over years of military experience and engineering expertise. But the most devastating revelation came in the final paragraph, where Sterling thanked me for my valuable contributions during the initial contract development phase and expressed confidence that the new partnership arrangements would ensure optimal project outcomes while positioning Apex for sustained growth in the defense technology sector. I sat in my home office, reading and rereading the email while trying to process the implications of what Sterling had accomplished. He hadn't just marginalized my authority or undermined my technical leadership. He had systematically transferred control of our most valuable intellectual property to competitors who would absorb our innovations and eliminate Apex as a factor in future defense contracts. The partnership with Northrop Grumman was particularly devastating. As the company responsible for intellectual property management, they would gain access to the mesh network algorithms and adaptive encryption protocols that had made our UCI proposal successful. Once they understood our technical approach, they could develop competing systems that incorporated our innovations while leveraging their superior manufacturing capabilities and Pentagon relationships. Sterling had essentially sold our competitive advantages to the same companies that we had defeated during the UCI contract competition, disguising the transaction as strategic partnership that would benefit Apex's long-term growth. The irony was profound. He was using our contract victory to eliminate the technical expertise that had made that victory possible. But as I continued analyzing Sterling's email and the attached partnership agreements, I realized that his corporate maneuvering contained a fundamental flaw that he hadn't considered. The mesh network algorithms and encryption protocols that formed the core of our UCI system weren't owned by Apex Defense Solutions. They were my personal intellectual property, developed during my military service and licensed to Apex through agreements that I had negotiated when I joined the company 5 years earlier. Sterling had committed to sharing technical innovations that he didn't have the legal authority to transfer. The partnership agreements he had signed promised access to proprietary algorithms that belonged to me personally, not to Apex Corporation. More importantly, the licensing agreements I had with Apex included specific provisions that protected my intellectual property rights in exactly the situations that Sterling had created. Spent the next 4 hours reviewing my original employment agreements, intellectual property licenses, and patent applications that I had filed independently before joining Apex. The legal documentation confirmed what I had suspected. Sterling's partnership arrangements violated multiple contractual provisions and potentially exposed Apex to significant legal liability for unauthorized intellectual property transfer. More importantly, the licensing agreements gave me the authority to terminate Apex's access to my technical innovations if the company attempted to transfer those innovations to third parties without my consent. Sterling's partnership agreements clearly constituted such a transfer, which meant I had legal grounds to revoke Apex's license to use the algorithms that formed the foundation of the UCI system. As Monday morning approached, I realized that I was facing a decision that would determine not only my professional future, but also the fate of technical innovations that could genuinely improve military communications and save lives in combat situations. Sterling's corporate maneuvering had created an opportunity for me to reclaim control of my intellectual property while exposing the fundamental weakness of his strategic positioning. The $2.8 billion UCI contract had been awarded based on technical capabilities that I owned and controlled. If I withdrew those capabilities from Apex, Sterling's partnership arrangements would become worthless commitments to provide innovations that the company no longer had legal access to use. That Monday morning, I didn't go to the office. Instead, I drove to the offices of Patterson & Associates, the intellectual property law firm that had handled my original patent applications and licensing agreements. By 9:30 a.m., I was sitting across from Margaret Patterson, explaining the situation and exploring my legal options for protecting innovations that had been developed through years of military experience and engineering expertise. Margaret's assessment was clear and decisive. Victoria, you have absolute legal authority to terminate Apex's license to your intellectual property, especially given the unauthorized partnership arrangements that Sterling has negotiated. More importantly, the UCI contract specifically identifies your technical innovations as deliverables that Apex is obligated to provide. If you withdraw those innovations, Apex becomes unable to fulfill their contractual obligations, which could result in contract termination and significant financial penalties. I left Margaret's office with a comprehensive legal strategy that would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. I would formally terminate Apex's license to my intellectual property, notify Pentagon officials about the unauthorized partnership arrangements that compromise technical security, and offer to continue UCI contract fulfillment through an independent consulting arrangement that protected my innovations while ensuring military personnel received the communications capabilities they needed. The notification letters were delivered at 2:47 p.m. that same Monday. Hawthorne received formal notice that Apex's intellectual property license had been terminated due to unauthorized third-party transfers. Sterling received a cease and desist letter regarding partnership arrangements that violated intellectual property agreements. The Pentagon received detailed documentation about technical security compromises resulting from unauthorized contractor partnerships. By Wednesday morning, the consequences of Sterling's strategic restructuring had become apparent to everyone involved. Apex could no longer legally use the algorithms that formed the core of the UCI system. The partnership agreements Sterling had negotiated were worthless because they promised access to intellectual property that Apex didn't control. Most importantly, the Pentagon began formal proceedings to evaluate whether Apex remained capable of fulfilling contractual obligations, given the loss of essential technical capabilities. General Rodriguez called me directly that Wednesday afternoon, speaking with the kind of controlled intensity that military officers use when operational requirements override political considerations. Ms. Carter, we need to understand whether the UCI contract can still be fulfilled given the intellectual property issues that have emerged. Our operational timeline doesn't allow for extended legal disputes or technical renegotiation. My response? Provided the solution that protected both military interests and my professional independence. General Rodriguez, I can ensure UCI contract fulfillment through direct consulting arrangements that maintain technical integrity while eliminating the partnership complications that have compromised security protocols. The system capabilities remain unchanged, but the organizational structure would provide better protection for classified technical information. Within 2 weeks, the outcome was decided. Apex Defense Solutions lost the UCI contract due to inability to provide contracted technical capabilities. Sterling resigned rather than face questions about partnership arrangements that had exposed the company to legal liability and Pentagon security concerns. Hawthorne accepted a buyout offer from Meridian Defense Group, effectively ending Apex as an independent contractor. I established Carter Defense Technologies as an independent consulting firm, securing the UCI contract through direct Pentagon agreement that valued technical expertise over corporate maneuvering. The contract value increased to $3.2 billion due to expanded requirements and accelerated timeline that eliminated partnership complications. 6 months later, the first UCI systems were deployed to special operations units in contested environments, where reliable communications could determine mission success or failure. The mesh network algorithms performed flawlessly, providing secure communications even when primary satellites were compromised or blocked by enemy forces. The adaptive encryption protocols prevented signal interception attempts that had previously compromised tactical coordination. Sterling's strategic partnerships had collapsed entirely. Meridian Defense Group terminated their Apex acquisition after discovering that the intellectual property they expected to acquire didn't exist. Northrop Grumman faced Pentagon questions about their involvement in unauthorized partnership arrangements. Raytheon withdrew from defense communications development after their UCI bid was rejected due to security concerns. But the most satisfying outcome wasn't the financial success or professional vindication. It was receiving messages from military personnel whose lives had been protected by communication systems that worked reliably when everything else failed. Captain James Rodriguez wrote from Afghanistan about artillery coordination that had been possible only because UCI systems maintained stable connections during enemy jamming attempts. Sergeant Maria Santos described medical evacuations that had succeeded because ground units could maintain contact with helicopter crews despite challenging terrain. The $2.8 billion contract that Sterling had tried to steal had become something more valuable than any corporate victory. Proof that technical expertise and military experience could create innovations that genuinely served the people who risk their lives protecting our freedom. Have you ever faced workplace betrayal that seemed impossible to overcome? The corporate world can be ruthless, but sometimes the best revenge is simply being better at what you do than the people trying to replace you. If this story resonated with you, or if you have your own experience with workplace justice, share it in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories about turning professional setbacks into incredible comebacks. Your support helps us bring you the content that matters most, stories about people who refuse to let others steal their success.